Adam Van Doren is a lecturer in the humanities program at Yale, where he teaches art, and he's also an associate fellow of Davenport College. He earned his Master of Architecture from Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, studying under Robert A.M. Stern and specializing in the Beaux-Arts tradition, which became an influence in his career as an artist. He was a visiting artist at the American Academy in Rome, and his fascination with Venice evolved over 2 summers spent studying painting there while living on the site of John Ruskin's former house. The landscapes and classical architecture of Italy have been an inspiration for Adam's artwork, alongside New England and New York City, where he actively maintains his art studio. Van Doren's artwork has been exhibited at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., among other institutions, and it can be found among the collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, the Yale University Art Gallery, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, among other galleries and museums. He has made 3 documentary films, one on the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and Columbia University professor Mark Van Doren, who is also his grandfather, another on New Yorker cartoonist James Thurber, and a 3rd film examines the story of Harold Ross, co-founder of The New Yorker. Van Doren is the author of The Stones of Yale, published in 2018, The House Tells the Story, Homes of the American Presidents, published in 2015, and Artist in Venice, published in 2013, and In the Founder's Footsteps, Landmarks of the American Revolution, published in 2022, and it also received the 2022 Distinguished Book Award from the Society of Colonial Wars. I'm really pleased to welcome Adam here today, and those of you who know me know that I love to highlight and shout out the publishing topics of our presenters. So this is a copy of, I don't know if you can see it, here we go, Adam's book. And Adam was an inspiration for us when we were planning our cruise to Venice this fall. And he said, you know, there's a lot of places that I think people have never seen, and I'd really like to take them there. And so we developed a really wonderful customized program for this cruise, partly inspired by the book, partly inspired by Adam's own expertise and experience. And I know that there are lots of people who will not be able to make the cruise with us this fall. Of course, we hope you'll join it. But we wanted to share this presentation for everyone to be able to gain a little bit of knowledge and insight, have a virtual experience of traveling to Venice, or make notes for your own travel plans, whether that's with Yale or independently. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam to begin the presentation. Remind you, if you have questions, we have time for Q&A at the end. Please put your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat. That helps me to keep track of all the questions. And without further ado, take it away, Adam.
Thank you, Lauren. That was quite an introduction. You can see that she's a professional at this. Thank you very much for coming, all of you, especially some of the friends who I recognize. It's a real treat to be able to do this. Be nice to do it in person, but here we are in the 21st century on Zoom. And so I hope you'll consider, not only after enjoying this presentation, hopefully, but you might consider actually the live version in Venice this fall, where we'll go not only to Venice, as I'm sure many of you know, but take a trip to Ravenna and then make our way down to the Adriatic coast, to Dubrovnik and other locations, and then coming back on the Sea Cloud, taking us through back to Venice at the end of the trip. But we're really going to focus on Venice today. I imagine a number of you have been to the city. I wouldn't be surprised, considering it's the most touristed spot on earth. So it's a challenge, but I hope to introduce you as fellow travelers to some new discoveries and experiences. For those who have not been, I can certainly say without reservation that all the endless photographs, movies, etc., are no substitute for actually being there. It's very hard to describe in words what it's like to be in a city of water, and that can only be done by coming. So keep that in mind. I was going to introduce myself, but Lauren has done that. So I will jump to just describing very briefly the course that I teach at Yale, which might be of interest to some, because I'm really coming from an artist's perspective. I teach a painting course at Yale to undergraduates, and it's called Mastering the Art of Watercolor, Classic Techniques from Turner to Hopper. And the basic focus of the course is to draw inspiration from previous masters. So I'll give a lecture on Sargent one day, or Hopper another day, or Prendergast, or whoever the person might be, George O'Keeffe, another great watercolorist, and then have the students try to emulate that work when they actually paint. So it's an old way of teaching art, but it's sort of a forgotten way, and I've tried to bring it back and have the students be scholars as well as painters. I've lived and painted in Venice for many months over the course of the last 35 years. And it's really an ideal city to paint in, especially because the buildings are low, which is atypical for most cities, right? In the world these days, especially New York, where I live and also paint. But with the low buildings, you get much more light on whatever you're painting. So it's very much more conducive to drawing that out in the work. New York is always a challenge because the sun sets behind the buildings very quickly. So the long and short of it is I love painting in Venice, as so many artists have in the past. Maurice Prendergast, as I mentioned, Sargent was also a great painter of Venice, J.M.W. Turner, and many others. Now, having spent a lot of time in Venice, I've also learned to navigate the city with all its serpentine narrow streets, many of which end up in dead ends, as I'm sure some of you know who've tried to explore the labyrinthian maps. But it's really what I've learned to do is escape the crowds, and that's the biggest challenge. It's overwhelming at times when you first arrive. I myself, having been there many times, it always takes me a couple of days to settle in because it's, oh my God, look at all these people. But they tend to come usually for only a day or two, and they go to the same places, San Marco Square, the Rialto Bridge, a couple of other sites, and then they're back on their boats or whatever, and they disappear. And they're too scared to go through the narrow streets and get lost. So on my trip with you, and I'm sure on the trips you might do on your own if you don't join us, you can escape the crowds fairly quickly. Not always all of the crowds, but much more so than the main locations. Now, of course, since Venice has no cars, it makes it very unusual and very contemplative as a painter, to be sure, but also just to explore and get into the mood of a city that hasn't changed in 600-700 years. I mean, I was reading a book recently which mentioned, and I'm sure I thought of it as well, that if somebody like Marco Polo, who's even longer than that, were to come back to Venice, he'd be able to find his way around, which is so extraordinary. I mean, the local baker and his local hardware store, if such a thing existed, wouldn't be there, but the streets would be the same. I mean, how many cities can you say of that? So that's, of course, extraordinary. And I thought I would just give you a brief description of the history of Venice for those who don't know it. It's made up of over 100 islands, which is in itself amazing. They're very small, to be sure, but they're linked by over 400 bridges. And the origins date from roughly 1,500 years ago, when refugees emigrated to this area, largely from the fall of Rome. There was a whole repopulating of areas outside of Italy, and well, within Italy, but outside of Rome. And what the Venetians were very clever at, those very early members of that group was that they found a spot, which is the Venice that we know today, which was these little groups of islands in a very marshy area where the water was very low. And the important aspect of that is that no invading ships could ever anchor close enough to invade them, because of course the water is so shallow. And that comes with its own price. I mean, they were maybe safe, but they didn't have a chance really to build for many years because the ground was so soggy. It took an ingenious set of engineers, if you will, from that era to conceive of what is one of the most unusual building techniques from that era. 90% of the buildings in Venice are actually built. Now, I should say, why don't we move into the PowerPoint? Want to go to the next slide? I'll show you some examples of that, because I don't want to get ahead of myself. Yes, well, let's start with this early print of the Lion of St. Mark's, which is the patron saint of Venice. And he always holds a book. In this picture, there's many, many versions of that. Let's go to the next slide, if you would. This is one of the earliest drawings of Venice from the, I don't know the exact era, but probably 1300, something like that. Let's go to the next one. This is a, now this is an early map of Venice, but you know, it's a tiny, tiny place. There are all these tiny islands. The whole thing is, I'm exaggerating, but it's not much bigger than a couple of Central Parks in New York. And that's what's so phenomenal. There's so much going on in this city, but it isn't a great swath of land. And the Venetians, as I was alluding to earlier, had to find a way to build these structures. So they came up with this. Go to the next slide. It might be on the next one. Well, we're getting to it. This is, well, can we step back a little bit? Go to the one just before that. This is a painting by Guardi. He and Canaletto were the great scene painters of Venice. Let's go to the next picture. Yes, this is how Venice is segregated into various districts and have for many years. San Marco, Dorsoduro, Santa Croce, Cannaregio, Castello, the Giudecca, and the Lido. These are all certain sections of Venice where we'll be going, but I just want to show you as a kind of a simplistic map of those 7 regions. Go ahead to the next. Okay, this is what I was getting at. What they devised is a method of using wooden piles through a special kind of wood that was not going to rot if you put it in the water. And it was a part of the foundation. I think go on to the next slide, which, yeah, thank you, which also shows a picture of that. Yes. You can see the limestone wall on the left, at least my left, the brick foundation, and then the bottom are these timber piles. And there they go into the soggy ground. They shift a little bit, which means that the structures can withstand earthquakes. And that's why Venice, I should say, knock on wood, I don't want to doom it by telling you this, but it has survived earthquakes over the centuries because it has a little rocking motion. But the basic premise is that it allows these buildings to be built on marsh. In some cases, there are some churches in Venice that have over 1,000 of these wooden piles. So that gives you a sense of how extraordinary that is. Let's go to the next image. Okay, this is Maurice Prendergast, who's famous for doing scenes of Boston and New York, but also Venice. You can see that the Ducal Palace is in the background, and these ladies with their sun umbrellas, all different colors, was obviously something Prendergast loved because he could explore the beauty of this rainbow effect of the umbrellas. Now, I wanted to say, backing up a little bit, that Gradually, the city grew from fishing shacks to these larger buildings that they could put on the wooden piles. And then over the centuries, Venice grew by, in many ways, ruthlessly invading other areas because they didn't have any land for agriculture. So, and very little, they couldn't, of course, have cattle or anything like that. There's no land area. So they went to the Adriatic. They also went to the mainland, but took various colonies. Some of these that we'll be seeing in Dubrovnik and whatnot were different names at the time. But over the time, this empire, which really has its height not in the Renaissance. The Renaissance, Venice is already starting to fade a little bit. It's really 1200 to 1400 are the height of the empire. And they kept these colonies. They fought to keep them, and it was back and forth over many years. I'm giving you a short snapshot. But during all of this, what is an historical phenomenon is that Venice maintained a republic for over 1,000 years. Now that's astonishing. Here we are in America dealing with all sorts of pressures in our own democracy. Venice managed to pull this off. They elected a doge, their version of a president, and that doge, though, was not reelected every 4 years. He had a lifetime appointment. But not to say there wasn't corruption of sorts over the years as well, but it did maintain its republic for that long period. I'm going to also mention that the area that I was staying in for a long time was on the Sacre in the Dorsoduro, and I hope we have a chance to walk through that. We will with the Peggy Guggenheim Museum, if some of you might have been to, which is in that area. And the site where John Ruskin, we'll keep going, yeah. The site where John Ruskin's house is now a Pensione Calcina, and I stayed there for a long time, and actually took Italian at the Dante Alighieri School. Some of you may know that who have taken Italian in Italy. There's several of these schools. I confess that my speaking ability is very limited after all these years, so we're going to rely on other people to do the talking for us. Let's go to the next image. After this one, good. That's Prendergast. Okay. Well, this is very telling. Again, for some of you who've been to Venice, this is nothing new, but this is not an atypical street width in Venice, the so-called calle. And these streets, you can barely get both arms across. And these streets, it also should be known, were not really meant for the upper classes. This was meant for the working class to bring messages to the people who lived in the palazzos, bring the food and whatever. I mean, I guess the version of messengers today, although that's even disappeared with Amazon. But the people in the palazzos, they came by boat, and they entered on the water through big openings in the bottom of their townhouses or palazzos. So this is a place where rarely any of those ever walked, and they were dirty and messy. People used to throw their garbage out the windows onto the ground. You can only imagine how it smelled. It still smells sometimes in Venice, so you have to take that with a grain of salt when the wind is blowing the wrong direction. But let's go to the next slide. Yes, this is an example of how Venetians would have traveled by gondola. And the gondola design and shape has been around for hundreds of years. They used to fill the entire lagoon. Now there's still quite a lot, but as you can imagine, mostly for tourists. And I would say that if those of you who want to take a gondola, your first instinct might be, oh my God, how touristy and schmaltzy and all of that. And that's all true. And it's expensive. I don't know exactly what it is for an hour, but it's an experience you must do because you really go through areas that you can't see unless you go by boat. And if you have a good gondolier, he'll sing for you. I would recommend it at night, actually, because you're not like exposed to everyone watching you as you go along during the day, and it's kind of mysterious. But it's worth really appreciating how Venetians travel. Let's go to the next slide. This is just a quick watercolor by Prendergast of a series of gondolas near the opening of the Grand Canal. Let's go to the next one. Another painter of Venice. I don't remember the name of this artist. Let's go to the next one. Yes, this is Turner, the English painter who traveled there many times, filled sketchbooks, some of which are in the Yale Art Gallery. But this is a wonderful view of San Giorgio Maggiore, which we will visit on our trip. That tower, or so-called campanile, is one of the hidden treats that we'll be exploring, because most people don't think to go there. They like to go to the campanile in San Marco Square, which is very crowded, long lines. But you take a little boat. I mean, this is a 5-minute ride. Everything is quite close. And you go to this Palladian church, and you go to the top of this tower, and you get the same magnificent view of the whole city that you would in San Marco. And also, it's a very quiet cloister and a beautiful church. Palladio is one of the great architects of the Renaissance, and this is one of the 3 churches he did in Venice. Let's go to the next one. Yes, I'll take a moment just to also briefly say that there are countless books on Venice. I would say the 2 subjects that come to mind that have been written about the most are Abraham Lincoln. I think there's a book that comes out on him every week, and Venice, maybe once every 2 weeks. There's always another angle that an author has done. I myself am guilty of that. My publisher liked the fact that my book was going to be my writing reflections on Venice and also paintings of Venice that I did. So that was kind of unusual. But there's always another angle. But the 2 books that jump to mind that I would highly recommend that are beautifully written. Well, one in particular is beautifully written. Jan Morris wrote a book called Just Simply Venice. And it's not bogged down with a lot of dates and historical details that can be overwhelming. It's just a beautifully composed book. Really, she captures the whole aura of the city and its history. I do recommend that. Another one, which is quite different, is Lorenzetti's, I don't know what that is. Something just came up on the screen. Okay. Lorenzetti's Guide to Venice, which was written almost 100 years ago. And the astonishing thing is, this guidebook has about 10 or 12 walking itineraries, walking tours, and the book is modest size, but it's well over 800 pages. But you can carry it around, believe it or not, because the editions are always printed on rice paper. So, but you do these foldouts. And the one quick thing I want to say on this book is that when I was using it, I went on this walking tour. And at one point, the author says, and you will arrive in a tiny little square, wherever this was, I've forgotten, and you will see hundreds of cats swarming around a wellhead. And I looked, and sure enough, there was hundreds of cats around this wellhead, even though what I was reading had been written 75 years ago. So that gives you a flavor of Venice. It's a wonderful book. So that's something else I'll mention. And there are other books, too, we'll talk about. All right, so let's take a tour. Well, after this, let me take a moment to talk about these slides, and then we'll get on our journey through some of the hidden spots we're going to visit. This is a little display of some of the famous residents of Venice. This is Marco Polo, who, believe it or not, his house is still there, or at least his family's compound. It's in a little tiny campo off the beaten track that several of the Polo family members lived in over the centuries. Marco Polo was already a multi-generational member of Venice. Let's go to the next one. Can you go on? Yeah. This is a painting of one of the Doges by one of the master painters of Venice, Bellini. I've forgotten if this is the father or the son, but you can see the extraordinary technique and craftsmanship going into this work. There's several Bellinis throughout Venice, but you see these silks and things that they would have gotten through trade, and just a magnificent work. Let's go to the next one. This is another famous resident of Venice. Maybe you recognize Vivaldi. He ran a orphanage for girls to play music, and that was how he made his living during the day. Then he wrote his music whenever. Astonishingly, most of Vivaldi's work was only discovered in the early part of the 1900s. It had been forgotten for centuries. I believe the story was found in a chest in a monastery. And so our wonderful Four Seasons, or his wonderful Four Seasons that we all know so well, was relatively recently discovered. Next. Mozart wasn't a resident of Venice, but he did come on occasion and had his work performed at the Venetian Theater, which is on our itinerary, to see a production there. Beautiful opera house. And there's a plaque in Venice, which if you keep your eyes open, you'll spot the home that he stayed in. Still there. You can walk across the bridge that he walked in and climb the steps that he would have climbed into this little house. Go to the next one. Henry James was a frequent visitor of Venice and included the city in some of his works. Let's go to the next one. This is Peggy Guggenheim, and her museum, as I briefly mentioned, is one of the great sites in the city. As I mentioned, in the Dorsoduro, it's mostly modern art. She collected very early Picassos and the avant-garde of the 1890s, 1900s, early 1920s. She bought a townhouse that was actually, or a palazzo, I should say, that was half finished. I guess she got a good deal on it, but she incorporated that into this whole gestalt of a very unusual modern museum. It's called the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, and very, very popular site, and we'll get a chance to see that. Let's go to the next one. Yes, this is Sargent, John Singer Sargent's painting of actually Americans living in Venice, the Curtis family. I love this picture because Sargent not only did portraits of people by themselves, but he could also incorporate interiors marvelously. He, of course, also painted many scenes of the Venice architecture in watercolor as well as oils. But he came to Venice on many occasions. Let's go to the next one. Okay, now we're heading on our little sojourn through some of these secret hideaways. Some of you perhaps have been to them, but I hope you haven't. Or if you have been, that you'll enjoy seeing them again. This is one that I discovered over the years, the Scuola di San Giorgio de Schiboni. And what's special about this particular building, which is the white building in the back behind to the right, just beyond that little bridge, that is where you are going to see 7 glorious paintings by the Venetian artist Vittorio Carpaccio. And Carpaccio was born in the middle 1400s and then died around 1520, 25. And we don't know that much about Carpaccio's background. Let's go to the next one. But we do know that he apprenticed to the studio of the Bellini brothers, who I mentioned earlier. These paintings they're in kind of a small space that kind of makes it feel like you're in a special place. You're not going to see a lot of tourists. Very few people know about it. And in general, beside this picture, maybe as an exception to that rule, he has done many scenes of Venice would show you the daily life, the costumes, rather not costumes, the fashions and the food and all of that that are so intriguing. He even has, and we might see it in this PowerPoint, a picture of the Rialto Bridge, which is a big stone bridge, the biggest bridge in Venice, when it was previously just a wooden bridge. But I love this painting here, which is the Vision of St. Augustine. One of the things I love about it is this little dog, this little white dog on the left of my position. And are you getting the laser point out? Yeah. This may be one of the most famous dogs in all of painting. Look at it, admiring St. Augustine, and it's just so charming. I always make a pilgrimage as a lover of dogs. I hope some of you are to see this. Now, supposedly, this is Augustine writing a letter to Jerome just at the moment he's thinking of the martyr saints, such as St. John the Baptist. On another wall is St. Jerome and the Lion. There's another panel of the funeral of St. Jerome and the two New Testament scenes. On the one wall are the legend of St. George. One is St. George and the Dragon. The other is the Triumph of St. George. And what else can I say about these without taking you there personally? They were painted around 1507. I'll make one note about this is that if I can see my notes. Yes, I wanted to make, because it's called the Scavone, that really comes from the term that relates to the Slavic immigrants that came from Dalmatia. So many of them came and found a spot in Venice to open a so-called scuola, a school or fraternity, and there's several of them in the city, but this is particular to this one, but also interesting because we're going to be going on the Adriatic coast, which of course was the former Yugoslavia. All right, let's go to the next one. We might see that one of the Rialto. Yes, here's Carpaccio's painting of daily life in Venice, and there's so much to absorb here and to see. Of course, this traffic jam of gondolas here, and look how the gondoliers are dressed. They still dress in costume, not quite the same as this, but if you look closely, you can see in the background the former, well, I shouldn't say, it is the Rialto Bridge, but it's the former rendition of it, which is in wood and has a place to lift up for sailboats to go under. But look around and explore this painting. And one of the remarkable things is that aside from that wooden bridge that is now stone, and aside from the outfits of the people there, the city really doesn't look much different. These chimney pipes are all over the city to this day. These little rooftop, it's hard to describe without a pointer, these little rooftop balconies or penthouses where they would have gotten a good view of the city. If you go further up in the background at the top, you'll see these little shed structures are all over Venice to this day. And punctuating the skyline of these 3-4-story buildings is always a bell tower where your cursor is going right there. You can always see that in the distance. And there's one on the far right at the top right. There you go. They still poke out in all sorts of places. And to my mind, one of the things that I enjoy most about the city is in the mornings and late afternoons when you hear the bells go off, one after the next. They seem to go from one church, then the next one starts, and the next one, and you get this whole symphony of bells. And, you know, a lot of European cities have bells, but a lot of European cities have cars. And so it's noisy, and you don't generally hear them to the extent you would in Venice. So it's particularly special. Okay, I'll leave you with one quote of Carpaccio's, I'm sorry, of Henry James about his visit to see the Carpaccios before we go to our next site. He describes the scuola where they're located. The place is small and incommodious. The pictures are out of sight and ill-lighted. The custodian is rapacious. The visitors are mutually intolerable. But the shabby little chapel is an extraordinary palace of art. So that is the thing to remember. And I think it's better lit than when Henry James was there. So you can be assured of that. Let's go on to the next image. This is another scene, actually, of the Lion of Venice painted by Carpaccio. You see a style of more earth-toned colors. You see the Venetian ships in the background. They're actually very telling descriptions of the skyline and the Ducal Palace and the Campanile. The rest of this is more fantasy, of course. Let's go to the next one. Okay, this is the Santa Maria de Miracoli. And I love this church. It's tucked away in a little corner of the city. And this beautiful Renaissance structure, early Renaissance, has stayed very much intact. Very often over the years in Italian cities and elsewhere in the world, marble has been stripped from many structures for use in other purposes. But here it remains intact, and it has this wonderful round pediment and these round arches over the windows and the entry door. And let's go inside. I believe the next one is an image indoors. Yes, it's covered floor to ceiling with these marble panels. The ceiling especially has we'll see shortly, has a group of portraits in the coffers. I think one of the things about the churches in Venice, there's so many of them, is, and maybe this is not the case with this one, because you can see the whole outside, but very often you'll see a little doorway of a church, and you'll think the church off of some narrow street is very small, because you just see a little doorway and it's dark and cramped. And then you go in and you see the space is quite large, because you just can't stand back far enough in Venice very often to see the structure that you've just wandered into. So it's amazing what you discover. This one is a little bit more exposed than some, but nevertheless, you're coming into this jewel. It has a little bell tower, what the Venetians would call a campaniletto instead of a campanile, which would mean little bell tower. Adds a little refinement to the church itself. It was built in the 1400s by the architect Pietro Lombardo, and is known for a wooden panel of the Madonna, actually by a French-born artist who became a Venetian, Zannino di Pietro. The panel is associated with various miracles, including the legend of a man who attempted, apparently, to kill his sister-in-law by stabbing her multiple times with a knife. But the miracle is that she cried out and was left for dead, but she miraculously survived. So that is hence the miracle of this church. Let's go to the next picture. I think we have a shot of the ceiling. Yes, you see this amazing coffered ceiling, and it's decorated with paintings of the prophets, and it's a work by an artist named Panacci. And if you can strain your neck a little bit when you're there, you can look up and see that. They sometimes light it up if you put some money in a little meter. As you know, throughout Italy, you often have to pay to see these things. Okay, we're going to jump now from this church to something very different. We go to the next slide. Well, let's take a break here and look at a canaletto. This is of the square Santa Maria Formosa. Everything in this picture is exactly the same. Now, I say that from my memory. I haven't been in a couple of years, but I can guarantee you, basically what you're seeing looks exactly the same today. Canaletto was a great documenter, if you would, well, of the city and its buildings. But in the far back, behind this church, on the left, is our next subject, and it's still there. There's a piece of Venice history that was once a brothel, actually, but over the course of centuries, it changed into various things. But there's a doorway that leads to what we're going to see, which is the Corina Stampaglia, which is a place where you can see some beautiful artwork. But the main source of the reason we're going, let's go to the next slide, is this architect, an Italian modernist architect named Carlo Scarpa. Venice, over the last many hundred years, has not really been very open to modern architecture, as you have seen. Partly because they know it can't really withstand much of the foundation that's required with this marshy ground. But also, of course, it's become the biggest tourist site in the world, arguably. So they want to keep it that way. But there have been a couple of occasions, and Carlo Scarpa was one, where they allowed a modern architect to do some work. Let's go to the next one. I think I was going to show you, let's see what the next one is. Yes, Frank Lloyd Wright did, I think, actually a quite interesting contextual, if you will, version of a palazzo that he was commissioned to design, but the Venetians rejected it. The committee or whatever that decides these things, maybe like the Landsmarks commissions in New York. So they were pretty tough because Frank Lloyd Wright didn't make it, but Carlo Scarpa did. Let's look at the next slide and we'll dive into more of this building that we're going to visit. Yes. So this is not a whole building that he did on the outside, but he did the inside. They allowed him to do that in this Italian modernist style, where every detail is thought through. You really, again, have to see this to appreciate it. But this was an obsessive architect who thought of every detail, the light switches, the outlet switches, the steps, the floor surfaces, the bricks, everything was thought through. And this is an institution that was originally founded in the 1860s, as I'm looking at my notes, at the behest of the last descendant of the Venetian Corini Stampaglia family. And Scarpa designed the interior, the exterior, and certain spots in the back, and garden elements that spread throughout the lower floors. I should say he also designed a few other, or renovated a few other spaces in Venice. The famous Olivetti, you know the Olivetti typewriters. There was a showroom in San Marco Square, which he designed that store. And let's go to the next image. Still in the same spot we're going to go. Look at these steps, how he's really thought of very original ways to design a staircase. I mean, a staircase can be a very mundane aspect of architecture, just utilitarian, sending you up and down. But Scarpa has rethought all of this, and in an interesting way, and no doubt he had this in the back of his mind, the famous Laurentian Library in Florence by Michelangelo. Some of you may not be aware that Michelangelo was one of the most influential architects of the Renaissance, even though he designed only a very few buildings. But there is a series of steps that spread out almost like dripping lava that he designed in stone. And I think Scarpa might have had that in mind when he did these in the Corini Stampaglia. Let's go to the next one. Yes, this is another version from looking above, where some of these objects like that bell and the statue are incorporated in this modern scheme of Scarpa's. It's not a great slide. You have to sort of be there to appreciate the intricacy and the beauty of this. And I haven't shown you all of it by any means. Let's go to the next one. Yes, this is also from the garden. You can see these rich details and use of metal and stone. He ventured into other areas outside of Venice, to Verona and elsewhere. I made a sort of a pilgrimage in my early days as an architecture student to explore many of Scarpa's works, and he did an incredible bank in Verona that I remember. He also designed a cemetery for a very famous family, an Italian family named the Brion family. And if my memory serves me correctly, he even designed his own tombstone, which is still there and where he's buried. Let's go to the next one. Yes. So I think I was going to say one more thing about Scarpa. Oh, yes. I mean, he is not a name that comes to mind readily today. But I should say, because he didn't design as many buildings as someone like Frank Lloyd Wright or Le Corbusier or some other great modern architects. But I will say that a Yale student who I do know, who's doing a PhD, recently wrote about Scarpa, and it appeared in the Wall Street Journal about 3 or 4 months ago. You can look that up if you get the Wall Street Journal. Okay, this comes to, I believe, one of our last sites, which is very telling about Venice in general. But we're going to an area on one end of Venice, which again, the tourists don't generally get to because it's far from San Marco. Again, nothing is far in Venice, but I think you've gotten the picture by now. It's all relative. It's in the outskirt edges of the city. And this is the Arsenale, or the Arsenal. And this is the entrance to the shipbuilding area of Venice, where ships were made. And this looks exactly the same to this day. Maybe one of those gondolas isn't there, but the entrance towers, that entrance to the left with the line of St. Mark's. This is a painting, by the way, by Canaletto. But to fully grasp the extraordinary aspect of this side of Venice is, as I say, it's a shipbuilding area. And Venice, at the height of its empire, became the greatest shipbuilding manufacturer in the world. And this was how they developed their power. Again, they're basically conquering other cities by water. They can't fight on land. So the ships are what, I mean, they can, but they can't. They're not really much areas to even practice the troops' movements. And those tiny little streets I showed you, how would you manage that? So naval power became their thing. But what I was getting at is they got to the point where they could produce one ship a day, sometimes two. And that's because they developed the early version of Henry Ford's assembly line. It was very novel at the time. There were over, 20,000 laborers working night and day to build these structures. Apparently, at one time, the King of France, I think from the 1600s or something like that, came to visit. And I think in one of his diaries or something, that by the time lunch came around, they had already produced the ship, sort of showing off a little bit. Maybe they did it faster than normally would. Let's go to the next slide. So the place we're going is, as it notes on the bottom, is the Museo Storico Navale della Marina Militare di Venezia. And this is maybe not as sexy as some of the other museums in Venice, like the Accademia and the Peggy Guggenheim collection, but it's historically fascinating. And it's the Naval Museum and shows, in the course of 5 floors, well over 300 or 400 models of ships, this being the biggest example of those models. And this is actually an existing ship. I mean, it's a real vessel. The other ones are models, but they have the models almost like you would see in a patent office where you see the maquettes of the final structures, but or inventions. But this place is chock full of these. Let's go to the next one. There might be some more examples. Yeah, well, this again is a full-size remnant of a ship. But the tourists definitely don't go to this place. I've been there 2 or 3 times. It's always hard to see all of it. It's just a lot to learn, but I never see anyone in this place. So we will have this to ourselves. As I say, pretty much everything else that we're going to visit. The Campanile in San Maggiore, I said no one goes there either. Carpaccio's space, which his painting are, very few visitors. No one knows about Carlo Scarpa. So hopefully you're getting some things that are lesser known. Also, I don't include in this PowerPoint presentation, but there's a wonderful printer that we're going to see, a letterpress printer who's doing the same techniques in letterpressing. A lot of Yaleys might have taken Raleigh Didamo's or Richard Rhodes's classes in letterpress printing in the colleges. And here they're doing this ancient technique, excuse me, to this day. And that's great fun. You can even order stationery from the man who we're going to visit, which I have done. Unfortunately, I used it all up. So maybe when I go, I'll reorder some of that. I was going to say, let's go to the next one. Yeah, and this is more like the ship models that we would be seeing that aren't life size. You see these long oars, these various developments of the technology of shipbuilding and ship warfare. But can you imagine, being an oarsman with these, looks like 40-foot long oars? Let's go to the next one. This is showing one of the great ships in Venice that does not exist anymore. But if you see that pink palace, which is one of the oldest remaining secular Gothic buildings, most of them, of course, are churches these days, and many of them are neo-Gothic, like Yale. But this is an example of the Ducal Palace on the right. Again, a panoramic painting by Canaletto. But what I wanted to point out is that gold ship, which is the Doge's barge, if you will, and that ship came out on special occasions, as you would imagine. But look at this unbelievable array of gondolas. It's just magnificent. And you can see, you almost imagine Handel's water music, although that was done in London on the Thames, but it would be more like Vivaldi's music in the background, as you see. But everything you see in this picture is there today exactly as it is now, with the exception of these, moving boats. On the left is the famous Salute Church by Longena with the big dome. Yes, keep going. There it is. We're going to try to have drinks in a little famous hotel just across the way from it, the Gritty Palace, where you can have cocktails at night and see that church lit up. That was built to commemorate the end of a plague, which we can all appreciate in the 1600s. And they have the Festival of the Redentore, which we're not going to be there for in September, but in July, the whole city lights up. And I'd love to hear if some people have seen this. It's one of the most spectacular fireworks shows you will ever see anywhere in the world. This city, the whole sky lights up, nighttime, of course, with these fireworks, and you just can't believe it. I remember my kids were somewhat terrified because the whole place was shaking and rattling. They actually create bridges over some areas with the boats. So you walk over the boats to get to some of these bigger structures that don't have an immediately accessible bridge. But this is this is Venice at its height, certainly in its glory. Again, though, interestingly enough, a little bit later than its glory of the 12 to 1400s, this would have been more in the Canaletto period, obviously, when Canaletto painted it, but it's still magnificent and hard to conceive that these people that are making such beautiful things are also, ravaging the coasts of the Adriatic and conquering these places and using a steel hand to keep them. But as I say, if you don't like the way sausages are made, you won't enjoy them. But Venice was not quite as ruthless as the Romans and other places, so we'll give them credit for that. I guess they had time, obviously, to do something so beautiful. Let's see if there's any more on this PowerPoint going. Okay, well, this is the Fenice Theater that we're going to see a concert in, hopefully, on the tour. And this is a jewel that many of you could not have seen if you visited Venice over the last number of years because it had burned in an incredible fire. And remarkably, it was rebuilt. I'd been to the Venice Theater 25 years ago before it burned, and I've seen it since, and they did an extraordinary job. It's not massive like the size of Carnegie Hall, but it's a mini version of that grand kind of space. Let's go to the next one. Yes, this is, I wanted to give you a peek of the, don't want to show you too much. You won't want to go on the tour. This is the San Maggiore courtyard with the campanile on the top right that we're going to climb. But this is that quiet cloister that Palladio would have designed as part of his church in this little island just off of San Marco. Let's go to the next one. This is this book I mentioned of Lorenzetti called Venice and its Lagoon, which has these walking itineraries. And the book, as I say, not lightweight like a Michelin guide. I don't even know if people use guidebooks the way I still do because everything's on the phone. But as Professor Gitlin knows, who's somewhere in the audience, we still have flip phones, he and I. So we enjoy books. But let's go to the next one. Yes, this is the book by Jan Morris that has been reprinted many times. The best book about Venice ever written, said the Sunday Times in the blurb at the top. This is not the cover that I originally saw, but as I say, it reappears over and over. Let's go to the next one. This is one of my favorites. It's not easy reading like a Morris book because it's written by John Ruskin, who would have been from the Victorian age. But this is the figure, the author, the art critic, who's also quite a good painter, that was the most obsessive of Venice in history. I guess you put Proust alongside him and a couple of others. But he went around the city measuring every arch, documenting hundreds of journals and sketchbooks with dimensions and details, and wrote this loving portrait, which, if I can hype myself, when I did my book on Yale, I called it The Stones of Yale, thinking, of course, of John Ruskin's book. There are, let's go to the next one, if there is any more. Well, I guess I'm concluding with this Lion of St. Mark's again, which appears over and over again as a symbol of Venice. You'll see the Lion of Venice throughout the Dalmatian coast because places like Dubrovnik and Hvar and Pula will have the signs of the colonizers, right? Throughout the city. They're still there. They didn't tear them down. And maybe Venice wasn't that awful to them. I wanted to mention also before I end that there's another book about Venice that you might enjoy. One is John Julius Norris's book called simply Venice, which is very scholarly, not in a pedantic way, but just a lot of history, but well done. But another book that is very different from these history books, if you will, is a series of mysteries written by Donna Leone. And she wrote these mystery novels that all take place in Venice. And the detective, the Sherlock Holmes of her series, the Dorothy Sayers of her series, is a man named Guido Brunetti. And they're fantastic books. I think she must have written 10 or 12. For those of you who've read them, maybe they know more about them. Maybe she's written 25. But it takes you through all the streets in Venice. The author knows everything about the city. So that's a great way to learn about the place. And it's quite accurate from my memory of reading them, of what the city is like today. So it's kind of a contemporary look through a novel and a fictionalized version of Venetian life. So I think that's it for my talk. I am certainly open to any questions. And Lauren, is there anything you wanted me to say or not say?
I'm gonna stop sharing. There we are. And I can come back on the screen. Okay, we did have just a couple of questions. I just wanted to note for everyone that all the books you mentioned during your talk, with the exception of the very last one, Donna Leone's books, are referenced in the chat. And so you can feel free to copy those down if you're wanting to look up those books. And then if you do have other questions that you want to ask, please do feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. We have a couple of minutes for questions. There are two that are here, which is that someone wanted you to repeat a couple of things because they didn't catch it. The name of the modern building that Scarpa designed was the first question. And I was able to pull up the Wall Street Journal article. So I'll put a link to the Wall Street Journal article in the chat for everybody.
Wow, that's impressive, Lauren.
And
so, should I answer the first part? It's cool.
Yeah, go for it.
Querini Stampaglia. Querini Stampaglia. And if I could get the spelling, I believe it's Queurini, Querini. And then Stampaglia is S like Sam, T like Thomas, A-M like Mary, E-A-L-I-A.
Got it. Great. And here is the article that was in the Wall Street Journal. I'm sending you an Apple News link. If you don't have an Apple News subscription, you should still be able to find it with the description that's there. And let me see if I can find really quickly.
The author is Max Norman. Maybe some of you know him.
There you go.
He went to Venice. I'm giving more details he probably wants to give out, but he went to visit a girlfriend he met during COVID in Venice. He was going to stay a couple of weeks, and he ended up staying 2 entire years.
Is that kind of what happened to you?
It's in a way. That's what happened to people. Henry James, Death in Venice, right? Thomas Mann never left. It does happen to people who respond to it, and it can be life-changing and can overtake you. Some people, that's not the case, but I'm one, Ruskin's another, and of course, thousands other. Lauren, I should add, visited it for the first time 6 months ago, and if I can say this, she fell in love with it despite all of her incredible adventures throughout the world. So,
it's definitely quite a haunting place. It stays in your mind long after you leave. I have another question that I think it's probably the same person wanted to know if you could repeat the name of the Naval Museum.
Oh, it's a long name. I had it up on the PowerPoint, so you could revisit the PowerPoint.
I'll see if I can pull it up on the PowerPoint.
It's written the Museo Storico Navale. Museo Storico Navale, basically naval history.
Rachel beat us to it. Thank you, Rachel. Rachel's got it in the chat for everybody.
Okay.
Yeah, that one is definitely looks like a hidden gem for sure. And Heidi wants to know if you can talk a bit about contemporary musical life in Venice.
Contemporary musical life in Venice. It's a very good question. And I have to be honest, I don't know about contemporary musical life other than there's a lot of music in Venice if you go, but they, from my experience, tend to play a lot of Baroque music. There's a lot of the Four Seasons. There are several venues, churches, and other places where they will have, I'm sure, modern composers, if you're thinking of that, or if you're thinking of pop music, I'm not sure. Uh, but there is a lot of music in Venice. There's posters everywhere of concerts on a daily basis throughout the summer, at least. I'm sure well into September. Outdoor concerts. It's a very musical city, so you will not be disappointed. And at times they have outdoor pop music too. I don't know if they're going to invite Taylor Swift. The city might, what's the word, sink for the volume of people she would attract. Um, but interestingly enough, when I was there many years ago, the Communist Party was very strong. I have no idea whether it's still strong there today. They wanted to attract new members, so they had a lot of outdoor concerts of pop music. One of my memories. Another question?
Yes, and I should also mention that on our program in September, we are going to see an opera at the Venetian Theater. So,
Fantastic.
yeah, yeah. So, Gail asked a question, which I remember you talking to me about. Gail wants to know, are there historical synagogues in Venice or any
Oh,
synagogues for
very
that
good
matter?
question. Very good. And I forgot to mention that because it's not on our tour, but very interesting. Uh, Venice has one of the oldest, if not oldest, Jewish ghettos in all of Europe. Uh, the word ghetto, G-E-T-O, in Italian is an Italian word, ghetto. And it's a closed, well, I shouldn't say closed off. It's a section of Venice that is still totally intact. It has a special opening, which was closed after the curfew of, I don't know what it was, 9 p.m. For anyone who was a merchant in Venice or whatever had to get back into the quarter, the Jewish quarter, by 9 o'clock. And they were relegated to that one area. And that area has the tallest buildings because they couldn't really spread out beyond the quarter. So they had to build up. When I say tall, it's 5 or 6 stories, where most of the Venetian buildings are 3 or 4. But you notice it's much higher structures. And presumably the Merchant of Venice in Shakespeare's play would have lived in this very area. So that's worth a trip. There's a documentary done by a friend of mine about the Venetian ghetto. She was an opera singer. She's passed a few years ago, named Regina Resnick. But she did a film on PBS, I believe, called just Ghetto, the Venetian ghetto, which is very interesting. And her husband did a series of sculptures, bas reliefs that are on site in the ghetto. So that's definitely worth a visit. It's in kind of a remote area, so you have to get up early if you want to pack in everything, but worth a visit. That was a long answer, though, but I'm glad you brought it up because I had it in
Yeah,
my notes and I forgot to
we have a
mention.
couple of additional questions. I
Okay.
want to go to Nancy's question next. Nancy is asking if there are recommended regions or neighborhoods in which to stay that are off the tourist trail and get one more immersed. And I wanted to sort of address that because something that people may not realize, especially if you haven't been there in a long time, is just how overrun with tourists Venice is. They recently have introduced sort of like a tariff for day trippers coming in. And when I was there last summer, the Venetians that I met said that actually most people have moved out of Venice who were living there. And the local folks live outside of the lagoon region, of the islands, and they take a ferry or something. They come in for the day, they shop, they hang out, they socialize, and they leave. And so mostly who's there are lots of people taking selfies and putting together things for their Instagram, including the occasional person who falls in because they refuse to sit down when they're on the gondola and the gondolier is telling them, please sit
Oh,
down. that's a that's a kind of a growing problem. And so it's a really good question, Nancy, because there are not that many places that are off the tourist trail. And that's why, we at Alumni Academy, we thought that this presentation would be really special to tell you how to find some of them. It's why we're excited about our travel program in September, because we're staying at a hotel called the Hotel Aquarius. And it's one of the few little spots in Venice that is, it's still local people living there. You walk out of the hotel and the local folks are sitting in the square and talking with each other, and the kids are playing. And I'm told by Venetians that you just don't really see that very much anywhere else in the region. So I'll put that information in the chat
yes,
for
the
you.
little Venice is full of these little squares that over time maybe less people congregate in, but I'm not talking about 100 years ago. I mean, when I was there as early as 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was still quite full. That's where people congregate, and old and young. So those are wonderful spots to hang out, if you will, have your coffee and whatnot. But they all always have a wellhead, so I don't think those work anymore. But they're great meeting spots. And what else did you mention? I forgot, but you mentioned about
Oh, we were just talking about people falling off the gondolas.
oh, right.
So James had a question if you could discuss the crumbling structures in Venice.
The crumbling structures, well, there's a lot of stucco comes off the facades, if you might be referring to that. That's even happening in the Canaletto paintings. The salt water and so forth corrodes that, and it has to be re-stuccoed. But if you're lazy or don't have the money, they tend to look dilapidated. That gives an aura to the city. If it's all shiny stucco, I guess Venice would look a little different. There are two islands, Murano and Burano, which are nearby. For some reason, they painted their stucco facades much more. Murano is famous for glass making. To this day, they have amazing glass blowers. It was a great export for Venice for hundreds of years. And that's, again, if you have more time, or you want to sneak away during the day one day, it's not that far, maybe half an hour on a boat, you can go to Murano. It's a long way to answer your question. But if you're talking about the facades, that is signs of deterioration. Otherwise, no one's quite certain whether Venice is sinking or the water is rising. But whatever it is, the first floor where the boats used to go in, you can see the steps are more and more underwater. That would have been where the boats landed and where they walked up 5 or 6 steps into the first floor of the garage, as it were, and then up into the second floor, the piano nobile, where they would have lived. So something's going on, but they're still standing. There must be crews that dredge the lagoons, the canals at some time to check on the stability of some structures. But the most amazing one, of course, the most amazing thing, of course, are the very large structures that have managed to survive and not collapse. The Ducal Palace, the Salute Church, some of the bigger churches. There are hundreds of churches in Venice that are quite large. The Campanile in San Marco Square did collapse in 1910. It collapsed just up and down. It just collapsed downward into a pile of dust. It did not hit any of the structures in San Marco Square, amazingly. But that's the most famous structure that I know of that's fallen.
We heard a lot for a long time. We kept hearing that Venice was sinking. and it was going to be gone soon.
Well, they've done some elaborate things in the edges of the lagoon to stop the water from coming in, and big engineering ideas that some have been implemented. They're very expensive, but it's an ongoing thing. I think this has been a challenge for a long, long time. So get to Venice while you can. No, but it's, you know, Italy knows it has a jewel there, that Italy has also got one of the largest bureaucracies in the world. So to get anything done, famously, they also have some of the best engineers in the world. But between the bureaucracy and the engineers, I don't know if they ever totally get in sync, but no doubt they're working on it. They have tried to stop, and it's gone back and forth, the huge cruise ships, which create issues with the water level and the weight of all those people. They've tried to stop that. I think they've been successful.
They have stopped the large cruise ships
They
going
also
in.
don't allow power boats to go through the little canals at high speeds because they rock the structures and these piles below them. So I'm glad to hear someone is very interested in the preservation of Venice.
Well, speaking of the waterways, David has asked if there's a central human waste management, or is all waste emptied into the canals?
Oh, it wouldn't be into the canals. It would have at one time. I would be astonished if that's the case now, although it does sometimes smell, but you don't know whether that's from another area, the water coming through. I've been there weeks at a time and you don't smell anything. So I'm not a great expert on that question. Maybe some people in the audience or when we go to Venice can answer that question. But they certainly don't have emissions from exhaust because all the cars are in one gigantic parking lot, Piazzale Roma, way over on one end of Venice. So you don't have that issue. And there's no mopeds, God help us, which is so noisy. So there's pros and cons of living in a museum. As Lauren had mentioned, over time, a lot of Venetians have left. They go to this city called Mestre, or Mestre, I believe, an industrial city that looks very depressing to me. But you can have a garage, you can park your car, you can have a new dishwasher, all of these things that, you know, a whole other set of generations would rather have than living in a crumbling stucco facade. I personally, and we talked about that a moment ago, I'm one of those people that loves that stuff. Have the facade crumble. I don't need a new dishwasher or a parking garage. So it's a certain mentality, but it is an issue for Venice because they want to keep the fabric of contemporary life intact, and it's diminishing. Of course, the shops are filled with shopkeepers, so they come in as commuters, as you're saying, whereas those shopkeepers probably would have lived above the shop 100 years ago. They now come from Mestre and other places. And as a consequence, nighttime is very quiet, except for the tourists, perhaps, but there's not a tremendous amount of people walking these narrow streets because there are not as many people living there in the evening hours. But God knows there must be wealthy people who've bought up a lot of these structures and come a few months out of the year. To have a palazzo on the Grand Canal is the ultimate. And you can't tell how extraordinarily elaborate the rooms and the decorations are from the outside. Some of the palazzos on the Grand Canal look ornate. Some are quite simple. You have the Moorish touches of the windows from that whole Byzantine trading and trading of ideas. But inside, I think we saw that in that Sargent painting, elaborate chandeliers and wood paneling and all of that is exquisite. So you can be lucky to, I don't know if we're getting so lucky to be invited to a palazzo, but sometimes you can be lucky and maybe you'll strike up an acquaintance or someone who will show you. There is the Cadoro, which is the most beautiful palazzo left in Venice. That you can visit. And Ruskin did a painting of that. I did a painting of that. if I can chime my work in. But that's something, you can see an example of.
Well, thank you. This has been a really fascinating presentation and very nice to take a visual and imaginary journey to Venice. And for those who are interested in taking an actual journey with us, we are doing 3 days in Venice, followed by just about a week on the Sea Cloud 2, which is a small sailing ship compared to the large cruise lines that we mentioned earlier. And our travel program is taking place in September, and we would love to have any of you who want to join us. It's September 16th through the 27th. You can learn more about it just by emailing us. We're happy to send you a brochure, alumniacademy@yale.edu. And Adam has very graciously designed our 3 days in Venice and will be giving us some lectures during the program to learn more about the architectural history and the influence of the Venetian Empire on the Dalmatian coast. And so I hope you will be able to join us, but if you can't, I hope this has been fun and interesting adventure for you and an inspiration for your own travels and learnings. And do take advantage of all the reading resources. Thank you so much, Adam, for giving us a fantastic reading list as part of your presentation. And I'll leave it to you if you want to say any last words. And before I do that, I'll remind people that they can find your book online on Amazon.com, An Artist in Venice.
I don't even have one. And I even have my book, I don't know if you can see it, on Yale, The Stones of Yale. I mentioned the Stones of Venice. Well, as I say, for those of you who have not been, this is one of those, pardon that gross expression, a bucket list, but you'd want to have gone to Venice in your lifetime. And those who have been once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times, I hope I've enticed you to go again and see some places that you may not have been, and to join me on this, because I would enjoy sharing my experiences, my discoveries with you. Lauren, great to see you, even over Zoom. Hope to see you at Maury's in the coming weeks before the semester ends.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. I see a few grazies and buonaseras. Buonasera to everyone.
Ah, that's impressive. I bet there's some, no doubt, Italian-speaking people in our audience. So
yes,
excited to meet some of them if they can join us.
Well, hope to see you in Italy. And if not, we'll see you on the next presentation from Yale Alumni Academy. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Ciao.
Ciao.